Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this enormously interesting conference. There are many speakers today, and I gather you had a very wonderful time last night at the, can you hear me? Is this working? I gather you had, no. It's on, yeah? Okay. And I gather you had a wonderful time at the concert last night. I went to another event and wish I'd had the opportunity to go to the last night, from what I heard. This morning now is going to have a great number of speakers. There will be a break and a book launch, which is very important for you to pay attention to and follow all directions in terms of assembly and what's going to happen. And then there will be further speakers and discussion throughout the day. My name is Jennifer Leaning, and I am the director of the FXB Center for Health and Human Rights at Harvard University. And the FXB Center is an all-university center. We have a great number of programs. We invite you to visit our website to see what our various focus areas are. But in general, we look at human rights in peace and war from the context of the most oppressed, most stigmatized, most vulnerable populations in the world. That leads us into looking at youth and adolescents and children, but families as well who are affected by war and oppression. The Roma program has been a key part of our assessment of the world since I would say at least for about 6 or 7 years. We've had 5 conferences on the Roma to bring attention to the extraordinary struggle of this minority population, which in many ways is among the most haunted and vilified population in the history of the world, dating back at least to the early medieval times. And they are claiming their rights, claiming their position, claiming their creativity, claiming their dignity in ways that have continued for 600, 700 years, but are now reaching full exposure and understanding and respect throughout the world. And we believe that here at the FXB Center, we have played a small role in bringing the talents and the struggle to light here at Harvard, in the greater Boston area, and throughout the United States. This program is focused, as you know, on the creativity and arts and celebratory activities that the Roma have developed over centuries to knit their culture together and to find the energy to continue in the face of the struggle. We have a side of this program which is fundamentally anchored in the human rights in peace section of our work that moves into the world of war and early warning for atrocity prevention. And that feature is looking at the rise and possible escalation of assaults on Roma populations in Europe. This has become a closer watch as European politics, under the force of many factors, including the war in Syria and the refugees hitting European frontiers, has turned fairly bitter. And within the country of Hungary, which from an early warning standpoint needs to be recognized as a country that has a history of atrocity and a history of participating in genocidal actions against the Roma, has become focused on harassing first the Roma, and we did a big report on this in 2014 and submitted it to the UN on the early warning signs of oppression. That was showing the enlistment, as always happens in Europe, as you go after one minority, you enlist attacks on the Jews. And now what we're having is, and you've seen it coming now, it's prominent in the news, the growing suppression of free speech, freedom of thought, and the attempt to crush one of the major leading lights of thought and action in Europe, the Central European University. And we have a strong attachment to CEU. The Soros Foundation has been prominent in the support of that university and in the support of Roma rights. And so as we speak, there are growing demonstrations and impending new laws and proposals in the parliament there to shut down on NGOs as well as the CEU. So this is a moment of importance for us to recognize that the struggle for freedoms and speech and the peaceful sense of having a biography ahead of you as an individual or as a member of a culture is not over anywhere. And we witness it in many different ways around the world. And today it is really a great honor and privilege for us to welcome you to this celebration of how the Roma have been meeting for centuries, their fights for a space at the table. And I'd like to introduce our beloved fellow, instructor at the School of Public Health, a PhD in political science, scholar and activist, Dr. Magda Matache. She will be introducing the rest of the panel and running this morning's session. And Magda is very well known to a number of you. She's won fellowships both in Europe and here, and she is one of the editors of this fabulous book that is going to be launched midday today. So Magda, could you please come in and take over this conference? Thank you.
I'm not going to use it. Good morning, everyone. Baktaro Romano Dive Romalen. Happy International Roma Day. This day represents a great opportunity for us at Harvard to benefit from all that you bring to us. This is the 5th year of a conference that we host at Harvard, and I'm really thrilled to see a growing community of people in Boston who are interested in Romani issues. We are also privileged today to host so many wonderful guests from elsewhere in the US, also from Canada, from Australia, and Europe. Thank you so much to all of you for being here. 5 years ago, Jackie Baba, Arlen Fuller, and I embarked on this ambitious Roma program at Harvard, with the hope that we might move the needle of Romani studies just a little bit, bringing in new methods, topics, but also approaches. We also hope to create connections to other communities of scholars, including those working on reparations or those working on using participatory approaches. And so we have placed participatory methodologies in research and Roma representation in academia at the core of our work, grounded in our belief that it is imperative to tackle issues that the Roma themselves identify as problematic, and also to involve Romani scholars and activists in our work. We also work with the student body here at Harvard to raise awareness about the importance of Roma rights, and we have many students in the room who've been part of an internship program that targets human rights violations against Roma. Given our emphasis in the Roma program, our hope for the conference today is to build on existing efforts of the Romani movement and the Romani scholarship, and suggest ways to shift from the racialized image of Roma in law and policy making, and in culture and the arts, but also in the academia. The inspiration for today's conference was The People with the Face of the Sun, a poem written by a beloved Romani author, Desider Banga. And I quote, "We are silent for thousands of years, but our hearts are full of unuttered sentences, like a sea, receiving blue river waters all its life long," end quote. And indeed, for centuries, the exclusion of Roma communities throughout the world has gone hand in hand with their representation as uncivilized, inferior, vulnerable others. An identity of criminality was imposed on us. For many non-Roma, we are still just the gypsies, or the Romani gypsies. But it's not only the Gage. We ourselves are also hold tied to this identity of a gypsy. We use anti-gypsyism or anti-Tsiganism to refer to anti-Romani discrimination. This is the only form of racism that is defined by a racial slur. And when we place anti-Roma racism into the broader global conversation, we see that the concept of anti-gypsyism cannot really be compared to anti-black racism, to anti-Muslim discrimination, or to anti-Semitism. Some scholars, I think both Romani and non-Romani, believe that this particular form of racism is directed toward the broader so-called imagined idea of gypsies, not only against Roma. But can you ignore the fact that racism has impacted the daily lives of Romani people for centuries? The attitudes, the biases, the practices, the hidden manifestations, all these have targeted the Romani people regardless of whether they are called gypsies or Roma. Moreover, by arguing that the actual object of hate is the idea of a gypsy, aren't we beginning to disregard the weight of anti-Romani racism? And it is not just that Roma identities have been misrepresented or shaped by stereotypes. Cultural and knowledge production has also strengthened white normativity and non-Roma privilege, or what I call gajoness. Also, our lack of social power has led to the lack of appreciation for the many creative and compelling contributions that the Roma have made to global culture. In contrast to other communities that face discrimination, the Roma have no records of Romani heroes or exceptional contributors to world history, nor are there Romani heroes in novels or movies. True, there are several ongoing initiatives that demand representation, including the Romani Pop Advocacy, in which a group of Romani young people demand that Roma be portrayed more fairly in comic books and movies, and the New Storytellers, a crowdfunding project implemented by a group of volunteers from Romania and led by my friend and colleague Gabriela Nenciu. I think she's here in the room. A project that tries to create the first children's book with Romani characters in Romania. That is sad. It's 2017. Still, these are not systematic changes, and institutions everywhere are reluctant to include state-sponsored injustices against Roma in the history books, or even to include Roma figures and topics in the school curricula. Why is this? Do people fear that including the Roma would mean giving up some privilege and social power? This lack of representation, along with misrepresentation and prejudice, continues to harm the Roma by denying them their social, economic, and cultural rights. And racism continues to militate against acceptance of Roma as an integral part of Europe, Canada, the US, or Latin America. But instead of focusing on anti-Romani racism, we, activists and scholars, Romani activists and scholars, educated in the Gaje system, have fallen into a trap. In the past 2 decades, we have mainly worked on changing the Roma, civilizing the Roma, integrating the Roma. In doing so, we have mostly neglected key issues for the Roma: racism, gajoness or white privilege, dignity, language, history, and culture. But can the oppressed move forward without changing the behaviors of the oppressors? So it is my hope that during the discussion today, we debate. I know that some topics are very challenging, including the anti-Gypsyism issue. We debate, we deconstruct, touch upon some of these sensitive and challenging topics, but also come up with some ideas to move forward. I will stop here because I want to hear all of you speaking today. But I would like to take a minute and acknowledge the work of many organizations and many people who have made this event possible. The conference was co-sponsored by our colleagues at the Center for European Studies, the Committee on Ethnicity, Migration and Rights, the Mahindra Humanities Center, the Department of Music, the Provost Fund for Interfaculty Collaboration, and also the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs and the Berklee College of Music. Thank you all for your kind support. Special thanks go to Steve and Homi, Sarah, Maggie, and Neil, and the whole team at the Mahindra Humanities Center. Special thanks go also to Stacy, who is outside, and she's our colleague from Harvard Kennedy School. I'll take a second also to express my gratitude for the support of my colleagues at the FXB Center, Hector, Krista, Susan Lloyd, Michael, Vedant, Miriam, Elizabeth, but also Aisha, Katie, and Sophie. I'd like to thank Jennifer for her trust in our program. And last but definitely not least, thank you, Jackie Bala, for being the driving force behind this conference and also the previous ones. Thank you all so much. Now I would like to invite the speakers on the first panel, Ken, Bettina, and Homi, to join us here. And while they set up, I just want to take a minute and ask a few logistic things from you. First of all, for the chairs, we have the bios of all speakers here. We have a very tight agenda, so I would really encourage you not to read the biases of the speakers, but rather to give brief presentations so that we have room for questions and answers. And also, for all speakers, please be mindful that we have a timekeeper, so try to keep your presentations 12 minutes. Thank you all.
Before I introduce the panel, I would like to thank Magda Matake for inviting me. I feel very honored to be part of this. And I also want to thank the team that was just mentioned and whose names I didn't memorize, so it has to be a collective thing. I'm particularly honored to be able to chair today's keynote panel in which Dr. Kenneth Lee will give his intriguing and thought-provoking presentation on archives of salvage, ethnography, ambiguity, ambivalence, and amnesia, and the traductions of Esmeralda Locke, and Professor Homi Baba will be discussant. This first panel attempts to provide a kind of theoretical basis for today's wide range of topics by looking at how over the centuries Gypsy or Romani identity has been constructed and corrupted by outsiders with social, economic, and political power. Both Kenneth Lee and Homi Baba are deeply committed to theory, and their contributions will provide abundant material for debate, both in this as well as in the upcoming panels. Before I briefly introduce the speaker, I would like to just mention that, of course, we are talking about theory. We are approaching the issues at stake from a theoretical standpoint, but of course the practice of constructing identities from the outside is still very much alive as we speak, as you all know. A couple of days I checked TripAdvisor to find out whether Rome, the city of Rome, is safe for travelers and what you have to bear in mind. And I got the information that Rome is a very safe city, but that one should beware of gypsies and pickpockets, literally. And I found this extremely shocking that a forum that we all use, like TripAdvisor, would still transport stereotypes of this kind, labeling gypsies as some sort of dangerous entity. That is, they're not pickpockets, but they're something else, but just as bad, or even worse. I would now like to introduce Kenneth Lee, and I found a short bio in a volume to which he contributed from 2005, from which I want to read some passages. Kenneth Lee describes himself, I think it was you who wrote the bio, I guess, as, I quote, a postmodern diasporic, Romani Irish, an untrustworthy half-breed, born in a horse-drawn caravan in Ireland, raised and educated in England. He later emigrated to Australia. His first academic qualification was in geography, and he taught in the Department of Geography at the University of Newcastle in Australia for over 20 years. Then transferred to the Department of Sociology and Anthropology, where he completed a doctoral degree entitled Constructing Romani Strangerhood. And then there's a curious phrase that I would like to quote: "He does not look like a gypsy." Somewhat surprising in an academic context, and I thought this was a very interesting sort of tongue-in-cheek remark that kind of sums up what Ken's research is about, namely stereotypes, labeling, and the deconstruction of these stereotypes and imposed identities. Ken's publications can, as far as I can see it, roughly be divided into two groups. One examines from a post-colonial perspective how gypsy lorism, that is the work of the English Gypsy Lore Society, discursively constituted the gypsies or Romanis as its subjects, and how English gypsy lorists gained what Ken called epistemic control over the Romanis. The other group of articles takes a far less theoretical approach to marginality, and I thought this combination is very interesting in itself. Ken has done research on the health status of European Roma and Australian Aborigines and Gypsy Roma traveler groups in Australia. Homi Bhabha does not need to be introduced to anyone who is familiar with critical theory. He's the author of numerous books and articles on a broad range of topics, from post-colonial theory, cultural change and power, to contemporary art and cosmopolitanism. He has held a number of distinguished positions in British and American academic institutions that I won't enumerate now. He taught at Princeton. Well, now I'm doing it now. I just said.
Don't worry about it.
Okay, I won't enumerate them. Since 2001, he has been Anne F. Rothenberg Professor of English and American Literature and the director of the Mahindra Humanities Center at Harvard University. In 2012, he received the Padma Bhushan Award by the Government of India, among other prestigious awards. Both Ken Lee and Homi Bhabha delve deep into issues of constructed identity, stereotype, hybridity. And like Kenneth Lee, Homi Bhabha, in his The Location of Culture, also establishes an obvious link between his specific biography and his commitment to theory. And I'll stop after this quote. Homi Bhabha writes, "I grew up in Bombay as a middle-class Parsi, a member of a small Zoroastrian Persian minority in a predominantly Hindu and Muslim context. And then in the 70s, I set out to study English at Oxford, where I got a PhD in English literature. Years later, I asked myself what it would be like to live without the unresolved tensions between cultures and countries that have become the narrative of my life and the defining characteristic of my work." And I think this is maybe a specific feature of this particular conference, that probably most participants have a very close connection between biographical, concrete biographical experience and the research that he or she is doing. And I'll hand over the floor to Ken.
Okay. Ken, you're going to show stuff, right?
Yes,
so
I'm
we'll
gonna
sit
stand
there so
up
we can
and
see it.
show stuff.
Good.
Okay, brilliant. I'm going to be talking about this Romani woman and her life, and I first need to position myself in some way. This woman's niece was my grandfather's first wife. She, the niece, later died after having given birth to a child. My half-aunt, my grandfather then remarried, and then that's the line that produced me. My grandfather's cousin also married one of Esmeralda's nieces, so there's all these sort of family connections. I'm still in touch with the descendants of this woman, this clan of people. So that's the first thing. Second thing is, I'll be mentioning a lady called Dora Yates, who for 50-odd years was the secretary of the Gypsy Law Society, who wrote a book called My Gypsy Days, a memoir of her involvement with Romani people. And in her book, she writes about Esmeralda, her gypsy sister. But I knew her personally. She'd known my father and his father before him and his father before him, 4 generations of our family. I also mentioned a guy called Fred Huth, who I also knew personally in the early 60s. So this is just to sort of position myself in relation to this pattern of knowledge building that was Gypsy Lawism. I would regularly visit Dora Yates in her office in the University of Liverpool when I was an undergraduate there. Okay, let's move on to the salvage ethnography. This was a phrase that was introduced by Franz Boas. And his notion was that we should now start collecting information about societies, socio-cultural systems that are decaying and degenerating, because in future people will be grateful to us for doing this. And indeed, this is the case. There are many people who are grateful that anthropologists and gypsy lawists collected information that wouldn't otherwise have continued to exist. To me, that's a fairly trivial reason for gratitude. A more important reason for gratitude is that this salvage ethnography allows present-day Romani people, indigenous people, to challenge the constructions of knowledge that have been imposed on them. And this is what I want to try and do here, is to delve into the archives of the Gypsy Law Society and uncover the various things that have been forgotten about the life of this woman in particular. And what I hope to try and show is that Gypsy Lawism can penetrate right down into the personal life of individuals and distort it in some significant ways. Let me start very briefly. 16 years old, Esmeralda and 2 of her brothers, along with a guy called Hubert Smith, are taken to Norway. Hubert Smith funds all this. They travel around Norway with donkeys and tents, and then come back to England. Hubert Smith writes a book with the precise but ponderous title of Tent Life with English Gypsies in Norway. Now, I want to show some of the images from this book. Okay, this is Esmeralda, the tambourine and the dress. Smith goes to great lengths to describe this dress, and I hope you can read it. A little more skirt, the bodice close-fitting, scarcely room for development, wonderful waist, quite tight on the way down, but more ample behind. He goes on to say there was no concealment of leg, and her foot and ankle were well turned. And you can sort of hear the drool dripping as he writes this stuff. He also later describes her having magnetic eyes, flashing eyes of fathomless fire. You can't quite make them out on this steel engraving, but they're supposed to be there. So this dress was specially made up for her. Later on, he describes in minute detail how they travelled. But later on he describes a scene. He's writing in his notebook. Esmeralda, who's 16 years old at this time, creeps up behind me and kisses me. I turn around. There's nobody there. Was it a dream? Was it a fantasy? What was it? I've got it down in my notebook, but I'll leave it there. I'll leave it in print. They then carry on with the trip, and we end up, this is the last image in the book, the end of the trip, and off they go. And you can see how this bulky male has grabbed Esmeralda, dragging her off, fires. He took her back to England. This is at the end of 1870, and he married her in Norway. He took her back to Norway and married her in Norway. What happened then was that the marriage was very, very unhappy. She writes in her own hand, her own letter, "I was sent away to marry a man that I didn't like, and he started to knock me about. But I gave him a good thrashing." She returned the compliment. She then had this hideous, brutal, violent marriage to this guy. But, and again she writes this herself, one day at Christmas time, just after they'd been married, 1874, he'd invited another Romany Rye. This was Francis Hines Groom, one of the founding fathers of Gypsy Lawrism. He invites Groom to spend Christmas with him at his house, where the men can talk about their mutual interest in Gypsy Lawrism. Groom seduces Esmeralda, and very shortly they elope, disappear to the continent, and then there's a hideous, scandalous divorce case. And eventually she then marries Groom and settles down to marriage with Groom. Now, due to the magic of Mr. Google, I was able to get a newspaper report of the divorce. And the legal counsel in the court case are saying things like, your worship will find this a very amusing thing. It's out of the run of the usual court case. And what happens, in essence, is Esmeralda is now depicted not as this wonderful seductress with the flashing eyes of fathomless fire and the raven locks, and all that's disappeared. She's become this vampire woman. Right? She's lying, she's deceiving Smith, which is true. She disappeared with Groom. She said at one stage, "Our marriage is bewitched. I need to consult an astrologer. I need to travel to Bristol." And he let her go. And of course she had a tryst with Groom at a hotel in Bristol. And he sent private investigators to find her. They divorce. Groom marries her. Absolute scandal. Partly because this is not the first time that Groom has run off with a married gypsy woman. I discovered this just a few days ago down in the Boston Athenaeum, in the archives of the Boston Athenaeum. He'd run away with another gypsy woman whose husband was off the scene and changed his name from Groom to Lee. I now want to be known as Francis Lee. That ended very quickly and he had to revert back to Groom. When they got married, if I can flick to the next bit. Okay, we've got all the events here. When they're married, they settle in Edinburgh, and Groom starts to work for Chambers Encyclopedia, the Gazetteer of Scotland. He's a busy, busy man with a day job, but he manages to write 3 books about gypsies, to be the first editor of the Gypsy Law Journal, to publish work in it. But at some stage, at a date that I can't find anywhere in the archives, they separated. It appears that the flashing eyes have been overtaken by the vampire woman again, because he writes, Groom, I hate to think of those days back at this address all those years ago. I wouldn't relive them again. Something hideous has happened in his life, and they've separated. He continued to pay her a small allowance, apparently by what's called a deed of separation in Scottish law. 1902, he dies. So Esmeralda is now left as a childless widow to fend for herself. She tries to return. How am I going for time?
Flow on.
Okay. She tries to return to her Romany life. She buys a horse and a wagon at the gaily painted caravan. she can't manage it on her own, but she takes up a relationship with another traveller, a man who isn't a Romany, but who travels around. And they're in this relationship for a few years, and eventually they separate. 1911, Esmeralda meets Dora Yates, and Dora Yates writes about this in her book. She has a chapter on My Romany Sisters, of which Esmeralda was one. Her first husband died the same year, so she's again left widowed. Fowler leaves her. She's doing the best she can to try and make a living. Now what happens then is the Gypsy Law Society had collapsed in the late 19th century. It was revived in 1907. And the secretary at the time was a guy called Robert Andrew Stott McPhee, and he says to the budding gypsy lawyers, go and see Esmeralda. Every gypsy lawyerist should meet this great woman. She's still seen as a source of salvage material. She still has knowledge of the Anglo-Romany dialect. She has information about customs and folk tales. And she also, of course, has biographical details about Smith and Groom, because what the Gypsy Lawyerist plan is a book about Groom as one of the founding fathers of Gypsy Lawyism. First World War comes along, and Esmeralda ceases travelling. She ends up in a static position. But one of the things about the Gypsy Lawyerists who came to visit, it was assumed, well, two things. The fact that she was literate, Groom had taught her to read. The fact that she was literate made her more accessible to the Gypsy Lawyerists. They could send a postcard to the post office where they knew she would be staying or travelling and say, can you meet Professor Woolner? He's come over from India. He'd like to talk to you about Anglo-Romany dialect. She was, in a sense, trapped by her limited ability to travel as a single woman, and the fact that she was literate and could be tracked down. Most of these gypsy lawyerists just apparently bowled up, enjoyed her company for a day or two, and then disappeared. Nobody ever bothered to ask, does she need to earn a living? Except one guy, a guy called William Ferguson. And he writes, I'm going to send her a postcard to let her know that I'm coming, do the courteous thing. But I think that I should offer her some recompense. I wouldn't like to see her lose a day's work on account of having to meet a boring old guy like me. This is the only instance I could find in all of these archives that any of the gypsy lawyerists ever suggested that she was actually had to earn a living somehow as a widow. To give him credit, Ferguson was good. She would write to him, it's terribly cold, can you spare me a few blankets? He would send them. He sent blankets, he sent cigarettes. She got to a stage just after Fowler had left, and she writes, my dear Rye, this is the way she always addressed the letters, to Rye being the top man of the Gypsy Law Society. My dear Rye, now that Fowler's gone, I'm on my own, I can't do anything. It's been a hideous winter. I've spent all my money feeding the old horse. I'm nearly starving. Can you lend me £5, which was a huge sum in those days, just to get back on my feet, treat it as a loan. And again, to his credit, he did. He gave it to her, and she promised to pay it back. What happens then? There's a hiatus from 1914. She ceases travelling. She's not eligible for the old age pension until she's 70 years old. She does collect it. But there's hardly any correspondence from Esmeralda or about her up until the 1930s, when she begins writing to Dora Yates, talking about being the Romany sister again. And one of the things that she'd said, Esmeralda had said way back when she started to write letters. She wrote to John Sampson, you may have heard of him. He was the alpha male of Gypsy Lawyism, the top lion rise. He was going to buy a wagon and a horse. When you get your horse and wagon, then would be the time to come travelling with me. And you could imagine that you were Old Smith with me, but you couldn't do it without me. And she's quite emphatic that you need me to be able to travel and understand gypsy life. She keeps saying the same thing over and over again when these wives come to visit. Let me help you. I can write with you. The very last letter she wrote to Dora Yates about 8 or 9 months before she died, she says, my dear sister Dora, I've got a plan. Between you and I, we could sit and write a book about my gypsy experiences. Of course, this never happens. This never ever happens. 1939, sadly, she's hit 85. She's outlasted 2 husbands. She's run over by a bus, and 6 weeks later she dies in hospital. At the funeral, there was only one member of the Gypsy Law Society who actually turned up to the funeral of this great woman who'd been such a beacon for them, such an example. And this was a man who'd only been a member of the Gypsy Law Society for 4 years. Very interesting man, another story, but he challenged the Gypsy Law Society and even registered himself as a company called the Gypsy Law Society and told the original lot, you can't do anything anymore, I'm the Gypsy Law Society. It didn't quite work out, but that's another story. Okay, a very rapid and sort of garbled sequence of events. But one of the things I want to mention, she said to Samson, when you get the horse and wagon, she and Fowler, who she was living with at the time, were actively looking for wagons to buy, to sell to the gypsy lawists. And every so often they would have a great idea, we'll go a-gypsying. Sorry, this is Esmeralda's sister. This is what she says, the very last words of her hagiography in the book. The world of romance is poor without her. May the earth rest lightly my wild and wicked sister because of the seductions and elopements and so on. Okay, this is Esmeralda, obviously on the right. 2 of the gypsy lawists, Atkinson, Thompson, he was the expert on collecting folk tales. But here they were staying with Esmeralda for just a few days. Thompson writes back to Dora Yates, I succeeded in hiring the wagon, the horse and man and so on. We're going to go a gypsy. And it turns out that what Dora and her brothers were doing was hiring out their vans to the gypsy lawists so they could enjoy the gypsy life. And you notice they go in the month of August. Nobody says, hey, there's a blizzard outside and there's snow on the ground, let's go a-gypsying. It didn't quite happen like that. But there are in fact a series of the gypsy lawists who hired the wagons and tents from Esmeralda and other people and went for their both trial as gypsies. Now what else do we have in here? Sorry, that's Samson, the guy at the back with part of his harem. The 2 ladies on the left are his postgrad students, and he was alleged to have serially seduced all of his postgrad students, including Dora Yates. The lady on the right is Rosiana Griffiths, who's a Welsh Romany woman. The guy on the right at the back is Bernard Gilead Smith, a brilliant linguist who worked in the Balkans with the Balkan Romany dialects. Sorry, I've done something weird. End of slideshow. So what can we say about Esmeralda and her life? The first thing, we have these gypsy lawyers trying to mould it into their own vision of what a gypsy woman should be. The fabulous eyes, the flashing fire, the braided hair and so on. And finding out that, the real world isn't like that she has feelings too. And she's quite capable of retaliating when he beats her. And this comes up in the divorce proceedings, because here she's being depicted as the vampire woman, the evil woman who ruined this man's life. And in the divorce proceedings it says something like, she had a temper and she had a spirit of her own. I mean, what a terrible thing to have for a woman. And she threatened him with a brass candlestick. And here I quote, "He was forced on 3 or 4 occasions on that day to box her ears in self-defense." And to give Dora her credit, when she writes about this incident, the brass candlestick has become a pair of silver candlesticks, and it's not just a threat. She actually fells him like an ox in his own house and covers him over the skull. But, so we have all this, these gypsy lawyers are trying to fit this woman into a mold, and she's rejecting it all the time. And she's challenging their authority. When she becomes literate, this opens up. You finished? Oh, thank you. She's opened up a space for herself, what the homie here called the zone of enunciation, or some people would refer to space of trielectrics. Or there's an indigenous academic, Martin McCarter, a Torres Strait Islander, who calls it the cultural interface, where things change, things can develop. She can create herself in a different image. She can affirm a new identity in contrast to the gypsy lawists. So, in a sense, she could be seen as a heroic figure for Romany women. She challenged this brutal, loveless marriage to Smith in the first place, and she broke out of it by seduction and elopement and divorce. I mean, scandalous things for any woman in the 19th century. A marriage to Groom, for whatever reasons, dissolved. I suspect that what happened there was, well, let me put it this way. In a biographical account of Groom, one of his colleagues said the change from bohemian freedom, and he was wandering about talking to the gypsies and collecting his language, the change from bohemian freedom to the bondage of labour was incredibly rapid. He became a suit. He was sort of trapped in an office all day, writing these texts for encyclopedias, going home at night and writing his own stuff and neglecting his poor wife. He'd gone to all the trouble to seduce and elope with and remarry. But for whatever reason, she got fed up of all this. I mean, it could have been a stultifying bourgeois marriage, and she wanted out, and she went back to her family. She couldn't really adapt back to Romany life because her family rejected her because of the way she behaved. And I'll finish, because what happened is she became yesterday's woman to the gypsy laws. As more information, more salvage was done, the salvaging of ethnography for the Romany, English Romanys, was all worked out. There was nothing left to find, so she was pushed to one side. Final thing, 1938, Esmeralda was 84 years old at this time, having the Jubilee dinner, the 50th anniversary dinner of the Gypsy Law Society. Dora Yates says, "I wanted to invite Esmeralda to preside." She wanted to invite Esmeralda as Groom's widow, still an appendage to the male, not in her own right or even as Dora's Romany sister. What happened was my great-grandfather said, if she turns up here, I'll go up and spit in her eye. I won't have anything to do with her because of the way she behaved by eloping and running off and being promiscuous around the place. So it was the final humiliation before being run down by a bus and left to die. And I could say more, but I've got to stop right now. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Leave.
Somebody's got their email open. I'll check that time off right now. It's right. No, it's fine. Oh, that's the. A video will come later.
Well,
I went ahead and just closed.
I want to thank you all for the FXB, my colleagues at the Mahindra Center, and several other collaborators for organizing this remarkable event on an annual basis. And Magda, I think that when the Gypsy Law of Harvard is written, you will be the Esmeralda. And I will be glad that I was part of the archive. I also want to thank Bettina for your generous introduction, and Ken for immersing us so deeply in a representative life. And I think that was very much the strategy of your presentation to us, that by looking at the details of an existence, one can raise significant questions about the larger conceptual issues and contextual issues that constitute a whole body of knowledge, because that's, I think, what this representative life was contributing to. Now, on the specifics, of course, of Roma history or Gypsy law, I know very little, and that, I think, is not my role today. But I have tried to focus on a few issues that I think emerge within the competences that I have, the more theoretical or conceptual competence, and I hope that they make some sense. And I hope I don't make sense for too long, because somebody is timing me, I assume. And I've just been told I can go for 15 minutes, is that right? Okay, 15 minutes, and just tell me. Thank you so much, Aisha. Very grateful to you too, thank you. So, I just wanted to return, Ken, to your first point about the archive. And you talk about the archive generally as a space of history, and one tends to talk about it like that. And there are several kinds of archives. There are national archives, there are archives connected with special groups, there are archives connected with universities, museums, cultural institutions, but I think what is really very important is that an archive is like a language. It is a storehouse of memory, and it is a storehouse of language. From the archive, you can make any narrative that you choose to make. So the archive is not inert in any way, because the archive is full of chance gatherings, issues, materials that are missing. The archive is like a memory, but from that memory you can constitute the narrative you want for a specific purpose, whether it's individual, institutional, ideological, or political. So I think we've got to see the archive itself as an internal dialectic between a storehouse of memory and the possibility over time of renewable narratives or renewable stories or renewable statistics, which then reconstruct that archive. So the archive is in a continual state of emergence. We have a sense of the archive partly because of the notion of national archives as being simply these storehouses of materials. They're not. The archive I want to propose today is as much about time as it is about space. It is as much about forgetting as it is about remembering. And that is not simply because somebody didn't go out and get that material. Because you can also have, Derrida, you mentioned, talked about archive fever. You can also have archive phobia, i.e. you need more and more and more and more, as if there is always more and more and more to get, You will get more, but the desire to get more, as if there's always a sense of completion, is, I think, a problem. An archive is not about completion. An archive is about construction. An archive is about the creation of new forms of knowledge. It is not about completion. And in fact, I would like to provocatively suggest that the thirst for completion very often destroys the creativity of dealing with what is not there, the interpretational right, the notion that we have a right and an important responsibility to interpret, to make bridges where actually the architecture of connection and articulation doesn't exist. So to the extent to which then I think, Ken, the title that you have chosen for yourself, Ambiguity, Ambivalence, and Amnesia, is inordinately apposite to the notion of the archive. And I want to say here that the emphasis on histories of oppression, the emphasis on the recollection of histories of oppression or resistance, or those who have been, as Woolf once said, forgotten from history, those who've been forgotten or whose lives and archives are continually threatened, that we emphasize the notion of presence. To make present is what we think is important, to retrieve things, to make people's lives and histories present. But we should not underestimate the importance of the fear of forgetting. Forgetting is not the negative side of memory. The anxiety of remembering, whether it is archivally or narratively, is in fact initiated by the fear of forgetting. Forgetting and memory work together. Memory is also a value. Memory is not simply the thing that forgetting is a value. Forgetting is not the thing that erases memory. The fear of forgetting is the continual spur to the construction of histories and the construction of archives. So I always refer to it as forgetting cum remembering, not forgetting and remembering. They are two interlinked and dialectical processes, and both of them, if they are going to be ethically and politically effective, have to acknowledge that there is not simply heroism in the reconstruction of repressed or forgotten histories. One of the most important ethical issues, as far as I'm concerned, is the recognition of anxiety, the notion of anxiety, that we are on the cusp of forgetting and remembering, and anxiety is actually, in that way, a very good thing. Anxiety keeps us continually on the edge of not collapsing into one or another kind of piety. So in a way, relating back to the archive, I just wanted to say that ambiguity, ambivalence, and amnesia are actually important elements in the construction of an archive. And indeed, forgetting is also an ethics. Forgetting is not simply the erasure of ethicality. Forgetting is the basis on which we make sure that we never simply say never again. So forgetting is a kind of negative politics that leads us to the normative politics. And I think negative politics is extraordinarily important. Negation, the notion of negation is extraordinarily important. So erasure is not simply something to be got rid of. You cannot get rid of it, and you should not get rid of it. And I think anxiety is extremely important in this issue. I wanted to also suggest, in listening to you, Ken, that we often talk about foreignness or foreigners or minorities, either in terms of inclusion or exclusion, integration or assimilation. But it seems to me, the more I think about it, that very often the fear of foreignness, as much as the fear of actually being a foreigner, is better described as a sense of intrusion. It's not assimilation and integration. There is always this fear of intrusion, that something is intruding, something is coming in there, and there is a disturbance around it. So I think it's important when we deal with these matters, which are, as you do, the recovery of difficult histories, or indeed confronting difficult moments in our own time, when we talk about refugees or migrants, etc. I think it's really important not simply to do this on the basis of political rationality, but to understand that these are issues fraught with a sense of threat, and I think that's, and we've got to confront that. Otherwise, I think we simply suggest again and again that if we adhere to our good principles, we will be able to deal with the problem. But we are not able to deal with the problem just by adhering to our belief in human rights or our belief in the Refugee Convention. This is very, very important. But increasingly, as we see, the notion of affect, the scale of affect, the way in which 8 people holding Paris can, in a way, obviate the fact that thousands and thousands of refugees have been settled and contribute hugely to the society. So I think that's a very important thing. If we don't take up the question of fear and anxiety, we don't get very far. I've been told I have only 4 minutes to go, and I have a lot to say, so I'm going to summarize very quickly. I think one of the very important issues related to anxiety, identity, integration, or exclusion is the fact that we've got to understand that when people constitute stereotypes of other peoples, they are themselves, they may be in power, but they are not free of anxiety. That is why when you hear a stereotypical joke, a racist joke, people always say, "You must have heard the one about." There's always this preconception that they will not be able to prove the stereotype. Therefore, they've always got to use a rhetorical formulation to assume that the stereotype actually exists even before they create the stereotype. So constructing stereotypes is deplorable for the victims of stereotype, but those who create stereotypes, as we know from racist stereotypes, as we know from the history of racist stereotypes, that they were based on absolutely absurd basis of knowledge, absurd science very often. And people were contesting them even when these absurd theories were created, that the producers of stereotypes are not without their own deep doubt about what they're doing, although they're not obviously the victims of it. I think I want to finally say from the story of Esmeralda that we've got to think about movement not simply as a condition, as a legal condition or a political condition or a historical condition. What came out to me most strongly in your presentation was the notion of movement as a way of thinking about the construction of consciousness. And through the construction of consciousness, the idea of movement as an epistemology, as a way of constructing knowledge through interruption, displacement, breaks of progress, dysfunction, through a whole. So in a way, movement or thinking on the move, as it were, or being, and I'm using being in a double sense, on the move, is not simply a historical or political problem to do with getting citizenship or settling or not settling. I think it is a way of thinking. And indeed, if you think about the work of Toni Morrison, if you think about the work of Salman Rushdie, if you think about the work of a whole range of writers, the very act of movement, to go from place to place, Du Bois, is a way that is something that changes one's sense of what knowledge is. Baldwin, of course, is a great example of this. And I want to finally end by saying that a whole number of narratives today which deal with the issues that we are confronting, whether it's refugees or climate change or narratives of resistance, are continually narratives where consciousness is interrupted by movement. This is another way of thinking about, to quote Heidegger, who's never easy to quote, being and time. This is another way of thinking about being in time and being and time. So it seems to me that what we really need to do is to find, in a way that somebody like Walter Benjamin was able to do in the Arcades project, and in how to think about the disruptive and interruptive movement of peoples and their consciousness and their experience, so that when we go back to the archive and construct a narrative, we are not simply taking the past as it existed, but we are for each problem reconstituting the prehistory and the after-history. Okay, now I've been told by Jacqueline Baba to stop, so I will. Thank you very much.
Would you like to respond immediately, Ken, or?
Just a couple of things. You mentioned the archive as a source of memory and history and language. Laura Stoller wrote about the uses of the colonial archive, specifically in relation to the Dutch East Indies. But one of the things she said was that the archive, of whatever source it is, whether it's a book or a novel or official statistics, these are sites not just of knowledge storage and retrieval, but sites of knowledge production. And I look at the archive of the Gypsy Law Society. It's revived in 1907. 1915, a guy called George Hall writes a book called The Gypsy's Parson. And he is drawing on the same letters that I've been reading through, the letters that have been stored there. And if you read this text, it is a full-on, riddled with stereotype gypsy lawist text. Leap forward to 2006, Deborah Nord's book called Gypsies and Romanies in the British Imagination, using the same sources, comes up with a completely different slant. So that the stuff is there, but it's there to produce knowledge in different ways for different people. And this is, if I can find the quote from this wonderful guy, Martin Nakata. This guy is a Torres Strait Islander, the islands between Australia and New Guinea. He wrote a brilliant book called Disciplining the Savages, Savaging the Disciplines. And the disciplining the savages part is about the Cambridge anthropological expedition to the Torres Strait in 1898, which was eventually 6 volumes of detailed anthropology. The savaging the disciplines is his deconstruction to show that they were full of bullshit from the start, that everything was wrong. And what he says, and it's floating about here somewhere, my task is not to know my position, but to know how I was positioned in and by Western disciplines and knowledge production. And I see my attempt here today is to try and do something similar. To say, well, what have these people done to create conditions that place us in these particular ways, or create us in these particular ways? Maybe go back to the comment you made at why did I write I don't look like a gypsy? Well, number one, it was my first attempt at postmodern irony. And I think it might have worked.
One, I have to say.
I think it might have worked. But yeah, because you're right, and you say, you know, Romani, and you were raised and born in a caravan and so on. There are certain expectations that you'll have certain phenotypical features, and I don't think I've got them.
You do.
I do.
Yeah.
I look like a gypsy.
Well, whatever
Wow.
that is, you could easily look like a gypsy.
Okay.
I think the problem really is this continual linking of certain ways of looking,
Yep.
or certain, this is not about, racism, exclusion, it is fundamentally a problem, even if you try to reverse all the stereotypes.
Yep.
So long as you sit within that notion of looking, skin, body, you don't understand it. It's not about that. That's why the Irish were always, that's why I say it,
Yeah.
the Irish were always considered to be black.
Yeah.
When
Yeah.
Froude wrote his work on the Caribbean, he said the people in the Caribbean, the natives, are black like the Irish. So that's the whole issue. And even when you reverse this question, you know, black is beautiful, white is ugly, green is fabulous. So long as you work within that kind of biopolitics, you are going to lose the argument. It doesn't matter to have a positive stereotype or a negative stereotype. You're still in the stereotype branding business.
We have two questions. I would just like to make a brief comment on something you said in the very beginning on the Romani being able to use the archives that are there to challenge the notions that are developed there. And I think this is a very interesting and also problematic thought. I have one example. There is a museum of anthropology in Vancouver. Basically, they collect material on the First Nations, and they have a film on young Native Canadians who study the things, the materials collected there, in order to build up some sort of new Native Canadian identity. They come from different peoples. They usually speak English, do not know any of the Indian languages, but their background is very different. But now they're trying, on the basis of this material that was, of course, collected not by Native Canadians, but by white newcomers to this country. But still they use this as a base to construct some sort of identity. And I have very mixed feelings about this because the material collected there is a selection.
Yep.
And I'm not sure where I stand on this, but I do think it is an interesting thought that you brought up, and I would like to know what you maybe can...
Any archive, there's got to be selection of what you collect in the first place, and things get lost or they're miscatalogued. It's always going to be incomplete. It's always going to be contingent. There really is no possibility of closure. This is what Derrida said, as I can quote here. Archive fever, which is contagious, by the way, so be careful. It is never to rest from searching for the archive right where it slips, because you're always thinking the next step will get me that piece that fixes the jigsaw puzzle. But it doesn't, it never does. There's always something else either being added or taken away, or the memory and the history is constructed in a different way. And the point you raised about forgetting and remembering, Jodie Matthews, who works with traveller communities in England, she's mainly in literary studies. She analysed 3 novels that have been written by gypsy lawyers, including Groom. And she said what these writers did was to, and here I quote, hasten the forgetting of that which they would conserve and archivally silence gypsy voices with their own. So this, we hear about Esmeralda. She's constantly writing to people, using her literacy to say, well, first to complain about a condition, to try and earn a living, to write in begging letters, but also saying, I'm important enough to have knowledge and stuff that is valuable to you, but I want to collaborate. I don't want you to take it. I want to work with you. But she's constantly refused. And I think this is a critical thing to the way that the stuff is selected. We keep what the gypsy lawyers got, but we're not interested in what Esmeralda had to say.
I was just told that we have 2 very short questions, so if there are any comments or things that you would like to contribute.
Sorry.
I don't want to open a big discussion here, but I want to just point when we are discussing about the archives, about historical politics. I'm coming from Poland, and I'm also very often in Hungary, and I see how child regimes are using historical politics to construct a kind of new history. a recent one.
Yeah.
Yes, in Poland is about the Wałęsa. Wałęsa is, by this new regime, is forgotten. Is not part of the present history. Yes, it is, and it is not very back in the history. It's very modern.
Yeah.
But you have still this danger that someone who is a historian or deals with history and has a power can construct it in the way you don't wish.
Yep.
So
Exactly.
here is the risk which I think we are facing as a Roma. Yes.
Yeah.
So I just want to point this out, that I fully agree with what has been said about the archive and the role and forgetting and constructing, but there is also a danger related to power.
But that's exactly right. The issue the issue there is that forgetting is, as I said, not some natural phenomenon. It is to be made to forget. And that's why I said the anxiety to keep alive, the anxiety is the issue. In Poland now, you have the museum, right? Yeah. Which is the new one, which is exactly the issue, where the new regime, there was a very enlightened, as I understand it, initial curation of this museum to talk about the war, to talk about various historical moments. And now the government has restricted the whole project of the museum and is imposing one narrative on it. But I think the thing to remember, I mean, I think what we who are in a position to actually raise these issues have to know is that this is going to happen. There are going to be acts of erasure which are politically motivated. There are going to be natural acts of erasure. But to think about the historical not as progress, not as linear progress, but as palimpsests, one on top of the other. So which is why you can unsettle the layers as different moments or interventions in the archive occur.
Yeah.
And I think that's the important point. Not to be naive or not to take the naturalistic metaphor of remembering and forgetting, to see exactly how it's constructed. That's why I said that political anxiety is almost more important than political virtue.
So go and read Orwell's 1984. This is exactly what has been or happens in the book. History is reconstructed day by day to suit the ruling classes.
We have one more question or comment.
No more questions.
Well, I have a very
Fire away.
simple question. I was wondering, I mean, Esmeralda, first of all, you talked about intrusion. This is people intruding into someone else's space. It's not the anxiety of intrusion, but they are actively intruding. Esmeralda being a woman, I was wondering, you mentioned the first marriage, that she said she was married against her will, trapped in this marriage. How did this come about, and am I correct in perceiving a sort of collision of two equally, or maybe not equally, but two kind of oppressive structures in which Esmeralda was trapped that proved equally toxic for her? And she seems to me to have been caught in between.
Yep.
A marriage that was, as you said, if I understood it correctly, forced upon her, then being exploited in all kinds of ways by the gypsy lawists.
Oh, yeah. We can't know precisely because the stuff isn't in the archives. It's, part of the palimpsest that you can't bring back. In Dora Yates's book, which the chapter on Esmeralda is a hagiography. And in the book, she says Esmeralda told her that her parents were rapacious and sold her like a young horse. That was the phrase, was sold like a young horse. Now, I thought, possibly, but then again, much more likely that it was simply an arranged marriage. That he'd, as we've seen, took her to Norway, young 16-year-old girl, she turned 17 while they're on this trip. There are two brothers there looking after her interest, we hope. But this guy, Hubert Smith, is drooling. He's writing about the figure-hugging but yet revealing dress and the contours and the gait and the raven, the flashing eyes. The guy's obsessed. And then he comes back, and again, we can only speculate. We say, look, what a beautiful daughter you've got. I'd like to marry her. Well, she's only 17, and, we need to look after her interests. And, okay, a direct sale, give me 50 guineas and she's yours. Possibly, but unlikely. My guess, earlier on, how did Smith know about these gypsies? He knew because his father used to allow them to stay in his property, in his fields. So one possible scenario is this. Smith wants the daughter. The parents say, what is probably the most valuable thing for us as nomadic Romanis is a guaranteed place where we can come back and stay for the winter, right? We're safe, we can't be hassled, we can survive the bitter winter. If you will let us stay, then we can arrange for you to marry our daughter, because according to British law at the time, if she was under 21, she had to have parental consent. I mean, that still applied up until about the 1960s. So it seems to me that if the marriage was arranged according to that scenario, she was the victim of a fairly oppressive patriarchal Romany system. Right? Okay. And then she steps into another one with Smith, and she gets out of it, and then she steps into an even more stultifying one with Groom, but by that time her life's ruined.
Can I just say something here, please? I think one of the really important issues that came out for me out of that narrative is how much prejudice, discrimination, and stereotype, as they attach to persons or groups, is based on the very unstable notions of sexual desire. For instance, sexual desire, dishonesty. We can never tell, is this person, this colonial native, telling the truth or lying? Is this refugee telling the truth or lying? Or criminality, between legality and virtue. So, and desire, promiscuity, the notion of promiscuity or virtue. Many of these stereotypes are built on structures of profound ambivalence, where the notion of, did he actually desire her, or did he want to abuse her? Was this simply power, or was it huge attraction that he could not control? This is why I said that those who construct stereotypes are themselves not in a position of some kind of powerful stability. They may have power, but they are themselves deauthorized very often by these issues. Isn't it interesting? Telling lies or telling the truth? Are they criminal or are they non-criminal? Are they desired or undesired? All these are deeply affective and ambivalent issues, which is why political theorists and legal theorists who always skirt these important issues, they skirt these issues because these are affective issues. These need a different kind of analysis than what is legal or illegal, what is right or what is fair, what is just. I mean, what is just about desire? And what is unjust about using that repressed desire of which you yourself are a victim to actually project onto some perfectly lovely person what your desire. So this whole notion of introjection and projection, the psychic and the rational, if we don't deal with these issues, which are really live, hot issues, we cannot understand on the basis of political virtue that discrimination is bad and non-discrimination is good. Of course that's correct. But I think the whole issue is how do we understand these very fraught problems? Thank you.